Hey everyone, I am just checking that I can be heard. Looks like it. Maybe heard. Yes. Okay. Yes. I can be. That's great. Welcome to this live. This is one of the weekly lives that rotate with the faculty. There's someone different usually every week, and also in time and day. So hopefully those who want to join live are able to at some point, and also all of these are recorded and then posted in the Vimeo playlist. You can find the playlist links in the courses as well if you search in this alumni group weekly live playlist. Lots of links will come up. It's been posted, I think, a lot of times by now, so hopefully there's lots of ways for you to find the old ones if you wanted to. Speaking of old ones, this is part 2. So a few weeks ago now, I've sort of lost track of time. A few weeks ago, I did the first part of this live, which was all about the opening of a yoga class. And even further from that, it's about it was about setting up the space, things you might want to consider, getting there early, connecting with your students, and then the centering, the grounding, and the opening part of the class. If you are in the throes of preparing your practicum class, then I think this series, the part 1, part 2, and then what will come in a few weeks will be part 3, will be really helpful. I hope it will be helpful in terms of ways that you can think about putting together a class. Things do differ from the practicum planning part of a class versus when you're out there teaching all of these public classes in different places and private classes. Things change. There are things you may include, there's things you may not include depending on the space you're teaching in. So always follow the practicum criteria guidelines that are laid out in the course, in case in this live I maybe missed something that should be included. But I think we'll get it all in, because this is more just about how to put together a class and things to think about when you are creating your yoga class. So part 2. So today's all about the middle section of a class. So we could call this the bulk of the sequence or the peak of the sequence, because I like to think about a yoga class having a sort of an arc. I have a pen and paper. I should use this for drawing. So looking a little bit like this. This is the beginning. So this would be like where we ground. We might be in Shavasana, we might be seated. Maybe we do a meditation or a pranayama practice. And then we start warming up. And maybe say, our warm-up takes us to about here. We're likely, after our warm-up, probably sitting on hands and knees or maybe standing, depending on the class. And then this is sort of the part that we'll talk about today, which is the kind of the bulk part of the class, where, let's say, all of the action happens. So if this was a movie, this would be like the beginning of the movie. It might be a little bit slow. And then we get to the action part of the movie, and then we have the closing, the cool down and the Shavasana of our movie here, and this will be part 3. So this was part 1, this is part 2, this will be part 3. This peak here, I just want to point out that having the peak of the arc of the class doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a peak pose. So if you're not familiar with what a peak pose is a pose that you are working towards throughout the practice. Sometimes the peak pose happens a little bit later, just depending on how you're choosing to do it or how complicated or challenging it is. But so a peak pose, I would say for the most part, but this is not a hard and fast rule, are generally poses that we could say are a little bit more challenging physically. It's not always the case, is the caveat, but For the most part, if I'm peak pose planning, I'm going to pick something like half moon, revolved half moon, standing splits, arm balances, things like this. And we spend the class kind of working up to preparing for that. But I teach lots of classes, and lots of teachers teach just well-rounded classes that have no peak, really, no peak pose, but do still sort of follow this same sort of arc of a yoga class. So that's sort of what we're going to be talking about today, is that middle section. So the first thing to talk about, last live we talked about the opening and intention setting, grounding, arriving. Now we're in the warm-up. So there's two ways I like to approach the warm-up that I'm preparing for a yoga class. Number one, if I am peak pose planning, if I do have a peak pose in my sequence that I'm working towards, then here's where I begin introducing some of the ideas, some of the movements, some of the body parts required for that shape. And oftentimes, I've found lately, in the last few years, that it's helpful for me and my students if I tell them where we're going, and let them in a little bit on the journey. So I use the warm-up as a way to prepare and to introduce the shape. So for example, say hypothetically our peak pose is dancer's pose. Now, in my warm-up, I'm going to do a few things that begin to help us kind of think about some of those movements we need for dancer's pose. So one thing is, in dancer's pose, we are holding the back foot with the hand or with a strap. So I'll definitely include a kind of movement that involves a bending of the back leg. So this dancing cat-cow, where you are in cat-cow and you have the floating leg bent, the foot pointing up, and then you're bringing the foot underneath you as you inhale and exhale. And then you can even stay in that balancing cat-cow and bind the hand behind you to hold the foot. And that's exactly what we're doing in dances. So we're starting to prepare the shoulder. We're looking at the accessibility of that type of movement. So I would include that. Or a low lunge with the bind. So you're in a low lunge, right foot is forward, left hand's off to the side, and then the right hand's coming behind and holding the back foot as the foot comes in towards the hip. There's different names for these things. But these kind of things I would include in my warm-up to help prepare the body. The other thing I could think about doing if I'm doing a dancer's pose thing, and I might include this in kind of the center more of the class, but also balancing poses like balancing cat-cow, and just noticing what it's like to balance in the body today. We're close to the ground. It's generally a pretty safe, steady place to start thinking about balance. And you could do some of these poses like this lunge with the bind, holding the back foot. Sometimes it's called lizard lunge, I think. And you can say to your students, notice how this feels in your shoulder as you hold the back foot. We'll be working towards dancer's pose today, so a lot of these same elements are involved. So just get a sense of what this is like in your body today. So we're also introducing the peak pose. Now, if I'm not peak pose planning, so I'm just sort of teaching a nice, well-rounded class, then I generally like to include a lot of the same movements from my warm-up. So things to get the body ready. Cat-cow usually is always in there in some form. Cat-cow sitting, seated cat-cow, tabletop cat-cow, chair pose cat-cow. You could do bridge lifts up and down with the breath. You could do low lunges, baby cobras, downward dogs, seated poses. A lot of seated poses are just great warm-up, simple twists. Forward fold, butterfly, endless possibilities for creating your warm-up. And sometimes your warm-up will be things that aren't asanas, aren't traditional yoga poses. For example, I love doing the neck stretch where you're just gently placing the hand on the head, these kind of thing, or just side stretches like this, or just neck movements, neck cat-cow. So you could create a whole class on cat-cow and think of all the different ways you can bring cat-cow. And we think of cat-cow as just a warm-up movement. But we can introduce it in the warm-up and then bring it into all of our poses, or many of our poses. Warrior One with cactus arms, and then we can think about cat-cow in lunges. I've done cat-cows in standing splits. We've had blocks in front, and we've worked on kind of rounding and opening. So you can get very creative, and your warm-up is an opportunity to introduce the things that might come later on. So sometimes we get the question, can I include, like rolling, like these kind of things that maybe don't have a name? And you absolutely can. You can just call them warm-up stretches on your flow when you're doing this, and that's fine. Warm-up stretches can be so varied and depends. And a lot of times I've noticed that the warm-up sort of changes based on what I've been kind of doing a lot of in my own practice as well. So different ways of moving the body. You can take things from other movement modalities. Lots of different ways of moving the body that might be helpful. I've taken things from Qigong courses that I've taken with the breath and use them as a warm-up for the shoulders. So you can get quite creative. So another thing to think about too is two of the most important factors when you are planning your yoga class and in understanding what determines what will be in the class is the style and the pacing. So the style, am I teaching a hatha or vinyasa, would be, the two sort of simple ways to think about it. But then we can subdivide that into, am I teaching a soft, gentle hatha practice? Am I teaching a vigorous, sweaty hatha practice? Am I teaching a gentle flow vinyasa? Am I teaching a really, really vigorous heating vinyasa flow practice, a power flow practice? And then the pacing, and sometimes I have a difficult time communicating, I think, effectively what pacing means. It's not just the speed of the yoga class, it's also the energy and the intention of the yoga practice that infuses the pace. So you could teach, and I've taught many times what my students like to call a sneaky power class, where on the surface it seems quite soft and slow, but we hold poses for an uncomfortable, maybe at times, amount of time. It's difficult, it's challenging, the body gets a little shaky, we're sweaty, we're heated, but the pace as a whole is a little bit muted. It's down a tone. I've taught hatha classes where it's been really fun and we've maybe not done that many poses and it's quite gentle on the body, but the energy and the pace has been quite lively. So these are two things to consider, like what is the style of my class and what is the pace, the intention and the energy that I'm looking to create. And that will help you put together your sequence. I'm saying this because if you were teaching a vinyasa class, your warm-up might be very, very different than the warm-up that I just described, which is a little bit maybe more of a hatha type warm-up, not necessarily, but if I was going to teach a power vinyasa class, I'm probably going to have a lot more movement in my warm-up. And I might even include some sun salutations as part of my warm-up because the bulk of my sequence is going to be quite vigorous and I want my students to be warmed up and ready. So I might include sun salutations in that part. But again, it really depends on the style, the pace, the intention, the energy, and also your students. So these are things to just consider. I actually took a class the other day that was a vinyasa class, 75-minute vinyasa class, and it started with sun salutation standing. I loved it. It was such a great way to begin. Got some comments. Aaron says, what a great idea. Thanks, Aaron. And then I often find my classes being a blend of hatha and vinyasa, and the pace changes as I become aware of the students and their abilities. Yeah. sometimes you don't know till you get in the room what's going to happen. So, and that's what I love about teaching humans, teaching people physically in that space, is you really do get a sense as you are teaching them. They help guide your class when you're observant and when you're watching. So that's a great comment. So this class started with sun salutations, and it was so fun, and it was great, and it was a really, really hard 75-minute class, but the sun salutations at the beginning as the warm-up made sense in this instance. So something to think about. So warm-up poses can vary. You can do your warm-up or do all the warm-up poses lying down. You could be sitting the whole time. You could be standing. So one thing to consider is, how do I want my class to begin? I love to start my class lying down for the most part. I find it's just a nice way for students to just more easily disconnect from the outside world. Therefore, my warm-up poses tend to start lying down. We transition to seated, probably hands and knees, a downward dog, and then I find my way up to Tadasana, and then starts the bulk of the class. For me, that tends to work pretty well. So the other thing to consider when we're thinking about warm-up poses, what's the theme of my class? What's the intention of my class? If my class is focusing on twists, then I want my warm-up poses to include some twists, supine twists if I'm on my back, seated twists, low lunge with some gentle twisting movements, things like this. If my class focus is grounding, then I want to focus on feet, legs, lower body. I might do foot massage, just having my students sit and massage one foot after the other. You could use a dowel or a ball if you have them in the space you're teaching in to roll out the feet. If you're standing, you could do some strap work with the legs. These are great warm-up opening poses to begin to set the intention, setting the theme. So I think if you are a newer teacher, a nice, I don't want to say safe, but a nice, perhaps simple way to be creative. If you're not comfortable yet, if you're not comfortable yet being, trying a lot of new things or bringing in new things into your sequence, maybe you've got a couple of sequences you're pretty comfortable with and you love teaching those. It's easy to lead these sequences. You could start to just be a little bit creative in the warm-up. Maybe bring in a couple of movements that are a little bit different, things that are easy to guide and that will help build your confidence to later on maybe try something a little different if you need to. If you choose to, you definitely don't have to. But I think the warm-up is a really lovely, accessible place to bring in a little bit of creativity and a little bit of you into your sequences. So that's the warm-up. It took 20 minutes. Okay, so now we're in the bulk of the class. We're in the bulk of our arc of a yoga class. So we're probably like here. This is a horrible drawing. So now what are we talking about here? Okay, now we're talking maybe sun salutations. We're talking standing poses. We're talking the warrior poses. We're talking balancing poses. Maybe a peak pose if we're working towards a peak pose. Sort of where the more intense and vigorous poses happen, with the understanding that intense and vigorous very much depends on style and pace, intention and energy. So in a soft, gentle hatha class, the peak of my sequence might be a warrior one. That's sort of the most that the highest that we're going to peak in this class. If I'm teaching a vigorous, really, really tough challenging hatha practice, maybe it's a series of standing balances strung together. I might go from tree pose to half moon to warrior three up to stand to dancers. Something that's a sequence of peak poses together. So again, it always sort of depends. If it's a slow, gentle hatha practice, it might not be that different from your warm-up. It might kind of keep the same sort of energy, same sort of intention. So your peak in that instance might be more like just that, like just a kind of a really soft, gentle curve. It differs. It really does. This is where, if you are teaching a practice that is a little bit more intense, lively, calls for a little bit more energy, this is where you as a teacher will likely need to help to hold the space for your students, to motivate them, to bring your energy up so that they're able to bring their energy up. For example, if we're doing crow pose, and that's very different to teaching crow pose in a soft, kind of gentle, if you're ready, coming into crow pose. And that's one way to do it. It probably works for some people. I've always found that I need to step up and be the person who encourages my students to explore within their zone of comfort. So now we're going to explore crow pose. So I got a couple of options for you. Feel free to ask questions. This kind of energy. Your music is really important here as well. So you can create a playlist that perfectly matches the arc of your yoga class. So that when you get to this center, this bulk of the class where things are really happening, the music can help you find your energy and help your students to feel supported in their own energy. So I find music is key in creating my sequences and a really important part of my class planning. I know that's not true for everybody, but for me it is. So I wanted to show you my awful handwriting and also the way that I like to lay out my classes. I just realized it's all backwards. But anyway, so this part is the opening. I've got Shavasana and then a 3-part breath pranayama. So I call it the opening of my class, and I write all my sequences out like this, and I label everything like this. Then I've got knee to chest pose. I'm reading it backwards. It's amazing. Thread the needle, and then roll up to sit, seated twist, cat-cow into something, gate pose. Oh, gate pose. I've been loving gate pose lately. And downward dog. And I'm calling that my warm-up. So you'll notice that I was lying down. I did a couple of lying down poses. We came up to sit, to do the twist, and then we came to hands and knees. We came to downward dog. And then I'm in this sort of center bulk of this is a hatha class, the bulk of my class here. This is where most of the stuff's happening. From downward dog, I come to Tadasana. Then I step to warrior one on each side in Tadasana. I come to downward dog. How am I going to get to downward dog? I'm probably going to flow down, most likely to come from here to here. This is where transitions are really important. I don't write them out because I sort of know or just play it by ear, but it's an important thing to think about. And then I've got, from downward dog, I'm going to go to high lunge and do a prayer twist. And then I'm going to come from downward dog to plank and do cobra, and sphinx pose, another back bend, downward dog to Tadasana, chair, and revolve chair. So it's kind of the peaky part of my class right here, doing those chair poses. And then I'm coming to the cool down and the closing, and I'm going to find my way from I've done revolve chair, so I'm going to come to Tadasana, Uttanasana, child's pose, couple of seated poses, on my back again, Tuni twist, happy baby, Shavasana. So I kind of put it out into those 4 parts all the time. And what I love about doing this, and I think I did a whole live on just this a long time ago, is I can just substitute poses out if I'm changing my theme. So if I was going to do dancer's pose, I would just change out a few of these poses, and I have a dancer's pose sequence, most likely, give or take a little bit. But I think that's, for me at least, just a really easy way to visualize the different parts of a yoga class, which is very overwhelming when you're asked to plan your first class and you're like, how many poses do I put together? How many poses should I have in my warm-up, the closing? How long should I hold the poses for? I know that this is an hour. It always is kind of an hour when I fill out a page like this. I probably take out a pose or two depending on the students that day, or add a pose or two depending on the students, but I know roughly that's an hour, and I'm usually pretty good and bang on with my timing. So this is why I think this helps me stay within those time limits. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about, so that's the bulk of the class, the peak of the class. Now, overall, in the second part of the class, I wanted to talk about something really important, which is about the logic of how we transition the body. So I would say for the most part, it's a generalization, but for the most part, you're probably going to be starting your classes sitting, lying down, or maybe in a child's pose or sort of a resting shape. Now, within that, there are tons of variations. You can start with a restorative shape. Restorative butterfly is a nice one. But just generally, we'll say probably one of those three. I know you can start standing, and I mentioned that I just had done a class like that, but I find that's a little bit less common, but it happens. But just for all intents and purposes, let's say we're starting sitting, lying down, or maybe in a child's pose. Now, your warm-up is an opportunity to slowly and methodically transition the body to where you want to be when you begin the bulk of the asana. So, for example, hypothetically, we're doing a class. We are lying down on the back. Had a beautiful opening, a lovely few moments of pranayama, and then we're cued, find your way up to stand. Okay, we could do that, and hopefully the teacher guides us and offers some options for the different ways we could come up to stand. However, I think there's a lost opportunity there where we can combine the warm-up with the intention to eventually come up to stand. How? We can do just a little bit of rocking on the back, and then we could encourage the students to roll up to sit. We could come right to tabletop position, do a couple of cat-cows, step to forward fold uttanasana, and ragdoll up to stand. That took a few minutes maybe of our time, but we gently and very compassionately got our students moving up to where we wanted them to be in a way that was guided, probably breath-centered, probably gave them some opportunities to be aware of how they're feeling today, and now we're standing. And you could expand that out a little bit more, add in a few other warm-up poses, pause in a seated position and do some cat-cows, come to tabletop, maybe come to a downward dog, and then step to forward fold and then roll up to stand. I think this is very smart warm-up class planning preparation when we do this. The same if, say hypothetically, you did want to start standing, and instead of just launching right into those poses, we can do a lot of our warm-up standing. We can do some neck stretches here. We can do some shoulder movements, shoulder rolls. Maybe we do a pranayama standing like they do in hot yoga. They often do a standing pranayama, this kind of thing, or we could do some cactus kind of arms, and we can do a whole warm-up standing. So we can definitely do that too, but we want to think about if we are sitting, lying down, or in a child's pose shape, how to kind of transition students to where they need to be next. It's not necessarily going to be standing. You could be coming from lying down and then finding your way to seated, hands and knees, downward dog, and then maybe you start doing some of the slow vinyasa broken down flows. If you're doing a vinyasa class and you're preparing plank and you're kind of warming up the wrists, the body, and then eventually you find your way to stand and you begin your sun salutations. So transitions and the way we get and move the body in the different planes of movement is so important in our class planning. And I think a big one is that we want, like, people came to our classes to be guided. And so we owe it to our students to guide them as much as possible, and to sort of, I like to think of it like we're creating a journey. And if on that journey there's some kind of abrupt, uncomfortable stops where we're kind of left alone to guide ourselves, it doesn't have the same flow. Whereas if I'm constantly being guided and led and offered some thoughts to consider as I'm moving my body, then it really does feel like I'm being taken on a journey of self-exploration, which is what yoga is, and what our role is as teachers is not just to guide people into the poses and help find the ideal version of the pose for that student on that particular day, but it is to create a wonderful 60-minute journey for our students so that they can tune out their day, that they're able to have some moments of peace, of letting go, of allowing themselves to be guided. And that's really what the huge pull for a lot of people coming to yoga is in the being guided and our role as yoga teachers. So I could go on for another hour about this, but I will wrap it up. So just as a wrap up, today we talked about the warm-up and about the center, the sort of peaky part of the class, the bulk of the asana. Part 3, we're going to talk about the cool down, the closing, and then the end of your yoga class. So I hope this was helpful. Sometimes I have a hard time following my own logic, but hopefully the visual of seeing it all laid out is useful for some of you. And if you have any questions, you can always just pop them in the comments. I'm happy to answer them. And thank you all of you for coming. This was so lovely. I love doing this. It's so nice to connect even in this virtual way. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Okay, bye.